this spiritual identity is really held in all of the people and all of the creation in a place, not just in the things that have happened, but in who the people are and what they carry.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
My name is Pete Armstrong, and I'm here with Gabe Kolstad from Multiply PDX. And we are so excited to have Renee Boucher with us this morning. Renee is from Prayer PDX and works with 24/7 prayer all over the Western United States. And we are so thrilled to have this conversation with you this morning, Renee.
Yeah, thanks for having me here today. Great to be with you.
Yeah, so this series is on the context. Context is so important wherever we're doing ministry or serving. And so we are looking forward to this conversation with Renee, and I just want to jump right in. Yeah. So I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your journey learning the spiritual history of Portland. And what does it mean that a city has a spiritual history? Yeah,
that's a great question. I'm going to start with that second part first, if that's okay. Just talk a little bit about what is a spiritual history of a city, because that sounds a little kind of out there, right? We may not normally think about that, like what's the spiritual history of my city? But I think, everything has a history and an identity. And so if we think about what makes up a city, there's the geographical location, there's the people, there's individuals, there's, the buildings, the architecture, the businesses, the things people do, all of it kind of comes together to make up the city. And so if we think about just these three parts, the creation, the individuals, and the community of people together, I think each one of those pieces has what we might call a spiritual history. I mean, creation itself, right? It was spoken into being by God, and it reflects who he is and his nature and character. And the same with individuals and with people. We also have a destiny, like there's plans and purposes that God intends for us to do as individuals, as communities, as people groups, and I think in geographical locations as well, that there's a destiny to place. So I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about Acts 17. We were just talking about Acts 17 before we started, but Paul's in Athens, right? And he's going through the city and he's looking and he's recognizing that, oh, wow, like there's a lot of idol worship going on here, right? And then he's taken in and he's being questioned. And this is what he says. I'm just going to read part of this to move on into the explanation. But he says, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing that you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. He's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, right? So I just love that Paul used the spiritual history of the people in Athens to preach the cry of what was in their heart, that they would be able to, he was able to point to the creator, to this unknown God, so that they would find God. And so I think oftentimes we see the destiny of a place trying to be worked out, kind of in some way, even if the people don't know God, because he's put eternity in our hearts. And there's that, there's that desire and that longing for people to find him. And so I just think, again, just thinking back to like creation itself, like there's these beautiful intricacies that the way that God has designed even like a small snowflake, like no two snowflakes are the same. You look at them under a microscope and you see just the beauty of that. And in the same way, he's like woven each of our individual identities together into a certain place at a certain time, so that in that place and time we would seek after him and find him. And so that community holds a spiritual history of what are we seeking after? How are we searching for that? How are we looking for the questions of meaning and of life and of creation itself? And all of that begins to make up the spiritual history. Does that make sense?
It really does. And it's so fascinating to think of the way our area is through that lens, because I think it's easy to get critical sometimes about the way things are or even negative about it. But if you think of it through that lens, it changes the whole perspective. I think that's a beautiful way to think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it allows us to see even like why people are acting in certain ways or behaving in certain ways, if we begin to understand, like, what is the identity and the purpose of this land, really? Like, we don't often think about, like, who are we together as a city and how can we live that out? But we do it without thinking. Like, so for example, if I said, what city is known for making movies? What's the answer? Hollywood, LA, right? What city's known for finance?
New York City.
New York. Yeah. What's the home of rock and roll?
Cleveland. I don't know.
I don't know. Would
That's
we say
rock
Nashville?
And roll Hall of Fame. Nashville, country music.
Seattle, grunge culture. You can think of different cities and they've got identities to them, right? But there's something behind that. There's something deeper to that. I think that even a geographical place or region has a primary purpose and plan and designed by God that is going to bring people to himself. So like here in the Pacific Northwest, there's so much beauty in creation, and it speaks of who God is. It draws us to the one who is the creator. We find peace and solace and, so much life in creation. Yeah. But then that can become a God in itself, right? Yeah. We can replace the creation for the creator when we're not understanding the bigger picture.
I know. Sometimes I live on the east side, and sometimes I drive down Stark, and Mount Hood is just there in all her glory.
Yes.
And you're, and like as a follower of Jesus and a person of faith, I'm like, God made that. And even Jesus and the Holy Spirit made that, like in the beginning, and drawn into that to just say, wow, God is so creative. God is good at making things.
He's really good at making things.
But then, I think so often as Christians, then we're lamenting and like talking down to people like, well, they're spending their Sunday mornings climbing Mount Hood, hiking around Mount Hood. And like, but that's part of their searching for God.
It is.
And to connect the dots and say, but Jesus.
Yeah. And it's a part of the, it's life-giving, right? We use that phrase a lot these days, what's life-giving to you? And it's being in the place where we feel close to the creation. It's really the longing in our heart for the creator, and that's life-giving. It's bringing something that is causing people to, I think, come closer to finding God. Yeah. I love, Mother Teresa always said when she looked into the face of the poor or into the eyes of someone who was dying, she always said, I see the face of God. Yeah. And I just think about that too, like just how every person in a city is an image bearer. And that, a lot of times as believers, we may, we may put up walls or we may not want to intersect our lives with certain groups of people, but every single one tells us something about who God is and is a reflection of who God is. And so this spiritual identity is really held in all of the people and all of the creation in a place, not just in the things that have happened, but in who the people are and what they carry.
Yeah.
So my journey, you asked about my journey. My journey was really quite by accident in looking into the spiritual history of Portland. I came here in 1988 and I was working with Youth for Christ, if you're familiar with that organization. I was working in group homes and jails and with kids at risk. And one of the things when I moved here that I found really sort of surprising was how many kids under 21 were living on the streets of Portland at the time. And back then, Portland was not what it is now. For people listening who were around back then, you'll remember it was, a darker place. And it wasn't the tourist attraction that it is now. It wasn't the foodie town. The Pearl District didn't even exist. People didn't go downtown for a lot of things. And so it was a pretty dark place. And so I saw these kids living on the streets and I just wanted to know why there were so many. So I just started asking questions, I started asking questions that kind of connected to their lifestyle and the things that were impacting them, and looking at different aspects, like whether it was the sex trafficking that was happening or the high levels of witchcraft and satanic worship or the drug addiction. It's like, where are all of these kids coming from? And why is there so much fatherlessness in the city? And what's wrong with our justice system and our foster care system that we can't provide a place? There weren't really many shelters for the kids or services for them back then. And there were underage clubs that we knew, like live sex acts were taking place on the stage. And, I could go on and on. The skinheads were really big downtown at that time. There were so many issues just centered right in the downtown area. And I wanted to know why, because I wanted to find, I felt like if I could find sort of that answer, then maybe it would help me find a solution to help these kids get off the streets.
Yeah.
And I saw at the time I was living in East Portland in a low income housing project. It was mostly like Laotian Hmong. And it was an interesting place. Like, again, Portland was different in the 80s and 90s. And I know there's a lot of violence and things we're experiencing in the city now, but back then it was pretty bad at the time. And so we would hear gunshots, in the park across the street almost every night. And we'd see the Vietnamese gangs would come in with sawed-off shotguns and they would just carry mattresses out of the building because people would, in that community, the people would sew all of their money into the mattress. So they just take it out, So we were seeing like firsthand, like in the space where I was living, just the brokenness and the vulnerability and the way that people are taken advantage of and the violence that was in the city. And so again, it just led me to question after question. And the more that I looked into, the history of the city, the more fascinated I was. I learned that at the beginning of when the city was just becoming a town, that all of the men left for the gold rush except for two, and just basically left a city of women and children. They never returned. They never came back. Most of them never came back. And I learned about the Shanghai tunnels, right? Like most of us in this area are familiar with that part of our history, but they would have trap doors in the bars and they would, drug someone's drink and open up the trap door. And a day later, they'd find themselves on a ship, being taken off to another country where they were basically going to be having to do slave labor and had no way out, right? Yeah. I learned about how we had the nation's largest abortion clinic before abortion was ever legalized. And the woman who ran that became so incredibly wealthy that it was just like ridiculous. The wealth that came out of that. People would come from all over the country to have abortions here in Portland. And that's not getting into all the political aspects of, abortion. It's just saying that there was a seeking after wealth, at the expense of women and children often.
Yeah.
we have more, at least at the time that we were doing these studies, we had more strip clubs per capita than any other place in the nation.
Yeah, you always hear that.
I think that's still true.
Yeah. And so, it's like, well, why? Why is that? And it's just the threads that went through history were just really fascinating, and just saw a lot of it was tied into seeking after wealth and prosperity at the expense of others, taking advantage of people who were vulnerable, whether it's women and children or people, of other nationalities. And so that just all kind of gave me some insight into, what I was seeing on the streets downtown. Yeah.
Can I ask you one other question? Because we've talked before a little bit about this subject, and one of the things that I remember, and if it's coming too early, that's okay, you can share it later, but about sort of the tribal activity and some of that, how that ties into sort of the devaluing of children.
Well, it's interesting if you look back into some of the history of even when the first settlers came, and they were at the fort in Vancouver. And actually, a lot of the men would take the native women as their wives because there were no other women, and so they were living here, and they would bear children and they would have families. But then when, and I'll get to this other piece in a minute, but they would have families, but then when women started coming from Europe, then they often just left those families and would actually then
remarry,
actually marry someone else and start another family. And so there was, even from the very beginning, there was this issue of abandoning the women and the children. And we did read in some places that even when they came across the river to, when the white men would come across the river to trade, that at times the First Nations would send the women to do the trade, because if they slept with the men, they'd get a better, value of the trade. But then if they came back then and, were pregnant, that sometimes they would be forced to basically slam their bodies against the trees to abort the child, Wow. So it's like there's this history in the land
of prostitution, really, and abortion.
Of prostitution, of abortion, of neglecting or devaluing or walking away from the women and the children in order to seek success and prosperity. Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit, Pete, but I'm curious how you feel about like the generational sin / curse nature of some of those things, because it's so weird that happened then. You're talking about the largest abortion clinic in the country, right. And what do you think the connection is between those things?
Well, John 10:10, right? Like, he comes he came to give us life and give it to the full, right? But the enemy comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And so whether that's through sin, through generational sin, iniquity, through curses, through broken covenants, like there are a lot of different things that open up the wounding and the brokenness in a city and a geographical location. And I think it just gives access for certain things to continue. It's, I love John Dawson. This is kind of an older, book, but he wrote a book called Taking Our Cities for God. And in that book, he talks about there are wounds in our city, and until those wounds are healed, we're not going to be able to see the transformation that we want to see. So it's kind of like if we think of, we have a wound on our arm, that's like deep and bloody and festering, and there are flies that will come, like this is disgusting, but this is kind of the, until we can try to swat the flies away, but until we actually heal that wound, the flies will keep coming back. And so I think there's something, an aspect of that where there's been an opening that has allowed certain trends to continue on in our city. And maybe at times they get sought after in different ways, but you can still see that underlying thread that's there. And so the question is, how do we heal those wounds? How do we close them?
It's so interesting to see how things got the way they are, And so tell us a little bit more about the generational sins, or maybe even the redemptive gifts of our city.
Yeah, I love that, because I do think, like I said earlier, I love the idea that there is a purpose to a place, everything is by design. Nothing is by accident, right? Everything is by design. And so we spent quite a bit of time just really praying into this and looking at this, like in the early 90s, late 90s, really. We were walking through just this process of what is it that God really desires for the city? And if we want to see transformation in the city, like, what does that mean? What would that look like for Portland? And so we started by looking at what are the patterns of iniquity that we've seen throughout history. So kind of like we were talking before, we could see this pattern from almost the beginning of the time that the white men came here, and we don't really know about before that, but we could see this pattern of that was a thread of fatherlessness and abandonment or an orphan spirit. And so we kind of looked over the entire region, and we felt like, it feels like there's a culture of death. Like at that time, Portland was very dark and very gloomy and very apathetic, and it just felt like we were I think we were one of the first places to pass into law the right to die legislation, and some of that stuff was going on then. And just everything felt very heavy. Like even driving into the city, you could just feel the weight of the oppression, as you drove into the city. And so we looked, without going into the detail of all of the history, because we just don't have time, but we saw threads of 7 or 8 different areas. So 7 different areas. I think one was just this fatherlessness and the orphan spirit. Another one was injustice and bondage. So a lot of that played into the addiction and the sex trafficking, but also we have an extremely racist history here in Portland. That we saw a city of outcasts, like, keep Portland weird, right? Like everyone can feel comfortable here. You're cast out somewhere else. Come on in. There was, we saw quite a bit of perversion in creativity. Poverty versus an elusive wealth and a lack of generosity, brokenness, division, and independent spirit. Like that's a big one because we're pioneers, right? And then just their occultic stronghold. And we saw those patterns of iniquity, and then we said, like, what is the opposite spirit of those things? And so for the fatherlessness, we said there's a spirit of adoption. Maybe this is a place where the Lord really wants to pour out that spirit by which we cry out, Abba, Father. That there would be a place of belonging and community here, that we would see justice and mercy and have a right understanding of what biblical justice and mercy is, the bringing together of all things being made right again, and the wholeness of shalom, exactly. The flourishing of all people, right?
Beautiful.
And then we've heard prophetically for years, people will come here and they'll pray over the city and they'll say, this is a city of refuge. So what does that mean for there to be a place of peace and protection for people who come here, a place of rest, a place of welcome, a place of hospitality, and of new life, really. that we would have redemptive creativity, you know, that the innovation and the creativity in all spaces would reflect the kingdom values and principles, and not in a weird way like we did, because
but just among the artists and what they're creating. And
we did just an aside, but we did an art show years ago down in the Pearl, and we curated work. We just asked for people to create work that reflected the justice of God. Okay. But one of the caveats is we said you can put no Christian symbolism or the face of Jesus in there anywhere, like no crosses, no doves, like nothing. And there were people who like insisted on putting that in there anyway. And we said, sorry, you can't be in the show. They were really upset. But I think there's, there is a way to, just to bring, that creativity with the redemptive purposes, that there would be fruitful prosperity and radical generosity. That there would be healing and unity. And then that we would be a city of prophets, kind of like I think of the sons of Issachar. They understood the times and they knew what to do. That would be the foundation, the people who lay the foundations to rebuild the city and restore the generations that have been broken.
That is absolutely beautiful and fascinating to think about. Where is the evil happening? And then the obvious thing, I don't really think like this, but the obvious thing is the exact opposite is what God is trying to accomplish. What a beautiful way to look at it.
Goodness is stronger than evil.
So good,
that's right.
There's a little Desmond Tutu song in my hymnal that goodness is stronger than evil.
Can you sing it for us?
Later, after we're done.
in the bonus content.
There you go. Watch the bonus content.
But to see the reverse of that,
right,
and to pray into those things,
right,
beautiful vision.
And it's fascinating too to think about, to see how. Again, like we're trying, even when we don't know God, we're trying to work these things out, so like there are things that we saw in Portland back in those days, like, and now like, in the late 90s, we were praying that the church would have a heart for justice. And, it's that the church, the greater church in Portland, that our heart would be broken for the things that break God's heart. Because at that time, like I said, I felt like there was a very apathetic spirit there then that I really feel like there's been significant breakthrough in. And I don't feel like
so much.
I wouldn't describe Portland as apathetic at this point in time. I mean, maybe in some places, but I don't think the church is apathetic completely anymore. No. And, but at the time, we were we just saw a lot of families were, so again, just kind of going down that list of the redemptive gifts, like we saw families adopting children. We saw a lot of nonprofits begin to rise up. And so now we don't see the kind of population of street kids that we did back in the day when I was doing the programs, because now there are services for them. And in the church, we have become really leaders out of Portland, like every child,
I was going to say the work that's done there with Ben and his team and just, every child organ.
And now it's expanding. Yes.
And Renee, that's such an interesting thing, because that's come up several times already in just the few episodes that we've done in this podcast, is that we're recognizing something, and maybe it's this creativity plus the justice, but something is bubbling up from here that the Lord is using, not just here. And it's pretty fantastic. Yeah.
And in each of these areas, like if we had time, I could go through and tell you, even like the Justice and Mercy area, we're known as a protest city. Like, we're known for activism. Like anything that happens, there's going to be a protest in Portland. Like, it's just not a big deal. Like it's just going to be what it is. But then we're having, even like I think of what Eric Knox is doing with Hollis School, and again, the contingent has so many things happening, but I feel like and Leroy Barber has done some great work. Like we have really, a lot of things in each of these 7 areas that the church has taken a hold of and has become a leader in, not just in Portland, but really is spreading out to the nation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of fascinating to see, as through the years we've been praying for these specific things.
Yeah.
That the fruit is starting to be born.
Yeah. And that's, I thank you for naming all those things, because I think it's important to say these are how God has answered our prayers over the past 25 years.
Yeah.
And this is what the Holy Spirit's up to today.
Right.
It just gives us so much hope that we're in the middle of something, you know?
It's really true. Yeah. Yeah. It's exciting.
Man, that's great.
Yeah, so it is. I mean, we've seen that on the podcast. We see that in conversation. Like when I talk to other Christian leaders across the country, like Portland is really different. The Pacific Northwest is really different. And it seems like the ground is hard, you know? So, what attitudes do you think define our metro area's response to faith and to the gospel, and how can we rightly respond? Especially, you know, it all begins and ends with prayer. You know, and that's obviously your heart. How do we lean into that?
It's interesting to think about just the attitudes, because again, like I've been here for over 30 years and I've seen such a shift, right? But I think like there has been a hardness to the gospel, especially in the past. I think there's a lot more openness to it now than there has been.
Yeah.
But historically, like people moved west to get away from the like they didn't really want to stay in the culture of the religion, and you know, there were a lot of different reasons they came west, but there have been a large number of people throughout the generations that have come here because it is a place that is not bound by religion. You know, I think the First Nations people too, they had religious beliefs that were based, again, like talking about nature and, you know, like the beauty of creation. We tend to turn towards the creation rather than to the creator. And look for answers there rather than thinking about, you know, what's kind of beyond the creation, like how did it get here? But I think there's this fierce, like individualism and that rugged independence. You know, we are pioneers. We're forerunners. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And we don't want to, be dependent upon anybody else. Like, you know, we want our own ideas. We want to be the first one to think about it. We want to be the ones that are right, and we're going to make it happen, you know? And so that just, I think we love the idea of that kind of freedom. We love the idea of being weird. You know, I mean, it really is just sort of packed in, of being different, of being, you know, exclusive or non-traditional or progressive or, you know, whatever word that you want to put to it. I think a lot of that just really does tie into this independent spirit. And it causes us trouble in a lot of different ways. And I think that we've lost the value and the understanding of community. And I think that's where a lot of our brokenness then begins to stem from as well.
Yeah.
So
when you were doing this pre-work and, you know, you've obviously refined it over time and you keep learning, what did you find out? What are you finding out about the history of racism in our city? And even now, like how it's impacting things and how we ought to be thinking about it and responding.
Yeah, that's a big question. You know, we could do an entire podcast just on that, and you probably will, hopefully, especially pull in some of the people from, you know, communities of color. They could speak into it a lot better than me. But just in terms of some of the history, you know, Portland is the whitest big city in the nation, you know, and so again, the question's like, why is that, you know? But it was the only state in the union that actually forbid Black people from moving here from the time it became a state. So from the very beginning, it has been legislated. And I think some of the language of that legislation was taken out as recently as the year 2000.
Oh my goodness.
So it's been there for a very long time. When Black folks came to Portland in numbers. It was during the time of war, and ships needed to be built, and so a whole community was created over in North Portland in an area that was called Vanport, but it was all built in a floodplain. And so maybe you've heard, hopefully you've heard about, then the floodplain flooded. Imagine that, and the entire community was destroyed and pushed up into what is now another part of North and Northeast Portland. And this is like, this is recent history. Yeah. Like there are still people alive who lived in Vanport or who grew up in Vanport, so this is like not 500 years ago or 2,000 years ago. Like this is like recently enough, like less than 100 years ago that people are still alive, So there's still a lot of pain there. There's memories, there's bodily memories, there's, relationships, there's, stories that have been passed down that people remember and lived. It was their lived experience. Yeah. There were things that, in Northeast and Southeast Portland, there were neighborhoods where there were actually gates built on the roads to enter that neighborhood to keep Black people out.
Wow.
You can still see like over by Laurelhurst, there's gates on one of the roads up there. You can,
that's why.
That was the purpose of them, to keep the Black people out. Redlining was prevalent, across the city, and just the practice of creating policies that kept it really impossible for specifically Black or Latino, but other families of color, to prevent them from actually buying land or homes. Yeah. And so that in turn prevents them from having generational wealth to pass on to their families. When we built, when the freeway was built and when the convention center was built in the Coliseum and Legacy Emmanuel Hospital over there were entire neighborhoods that were part of the Black community that were just, taken away. I have a good friend, a pastor in town, who her grandmother owned a home in that neighborhood. And she said, they just gave them really pennies on the dollar for the home. And it wasn't until the last few years that anyone in her family was able to own a home. Oh. Generationally, that, again, just that wealth was taken away. Because we know the value of actually owning our home versus renting, year after year. I'm just thinking through some of the other, in Portland, Blacks and Latinos are discriminated against when renting probably 64% of the time, according to an audit in 2011. We know that kids of color are suspended 4 times more than their peers for the same actions. It continues on today. And we could talk, that's just like a very small, part of what the Black community has experienced here in Portland. We could talk about how the Japanese families were sent to internment camps, during the war. They lost all their possessions, their businesses, everything, and it was never returned to them. The Chinese suffered just incredible discrimination and persecution. There were laws that were written just in terms of who could actually immigrate to the country, and they would allow the Chinese men to come, but they would not allow the women to come, so that the lineage would stop, and no more families would, be brought up here. So we could talk about the First Nations, which we know just the land that was stolen, and how children were forced to go to the residential schools, and some of the atrocities that happened there. That's, we've heard quite a bit in the news about what happened in Canada. But that's all the Pacific Northwest. It happened here too. So there's just a great amount of pain that exists here in the land that we can't ignore. And it's carried through the generations, and the policies and the practices continue today. And so I think until we really learn how to listen and to hear the stories, and we begin to practice lament and really enter into that space of like recognizing that there are things that are built into our systems that don't allow for healing and for change, then, we're not going to be able to get where we want to go. And we have to learn to walk alongside of people. Like, we have to learn how to journey together with people, because I think we have this tendency as believers to want to save everybody, but Jesus already saved everybody. Like, we don't have to try to do that again. Like how about we just embody his presence and the love and the grace and the mercy, and learn how to just walk beside people and receive from them as much as we try to give. Like, there's so much beauty and wealth and expression and wisdom in these communities of color that I've just been trying to learn as much as I can over the last 10 years and just walk in friendship, that like I don't have anything to give. I just need to listen and to learn and to walk in that place of lament and understand the pain that has been there.
Yeah. Even as you think about like a church of suffering and like participating in the sufferings of Christ. And like, as we think about that in Lent, or even like, Holy Week and Good Friday, and looking at, what it means to journey and learn from that, instead of coming from a place of triumphalism and, kind of skipping over, I feel like so much of the white evangelical church, it's like, Palm Sunday and whatever understanding of that is. And then we jump right to Easter and resurrection. And,
it's hard to hear all of that, honestly, because, I think maybe my own perspective is a lot of times idealism and optimism, and just to just wrestle with the reality of how deep all that is, and how difficult it will be to repent from all of that. I can see that's quite a journey for all of us. Yeah.
It requires a lot of humility, right? Like authentic. And I think this really ties, like, beyond racism, this is really the essence of, like, if we're really going to be able to bring the gospel, like the good news, to Portland, to this region, the Pacific Northwest, like, we have to master humility. We have to be able to like go really low, because everything that is built into, like we talk about all those iniquities and everything that's sort of like laid out in the land, all of it speaks to lifting ourselves up. It all, lends itself to trying to create a platform, trying to create a reputation, trying to do it ourselves,
It's works righteousness.
And the answer, like, again, the opposite of that. What's the opposite of that? Like, I'm going to lay myself flat on the ground, I'm going to consider myself nothing. Like, I'm going to put other people's interests higher than my own. I'm going to take on the very nature of Christ, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself, a servant to all, so like how do we actually live out the cross in that way, that we would lay down our lives for another. Like, this is what love is, that we would lay down our lives. And how do we practice radical hospitality, that we would love the stranger, those who are unfamiliar and not like us? Like, how would we really begin to practice that, and what could happen if we did? I think, it would be amazing.
I still feel like there needs to be a book written about all of this stuff, because I think it could be so helpful for our city to just have more in front of us about how things are, how things got the way they are, and maybe what the way forward is.
Yeah.
Based on your 30 years of praying about these things, researching, talking with people, journeying with people, what do you think that our city and our region really need the most?
I think we've lost this understanding of community and interdependence.
Yeah.
You know, that like even today, I think cities all over are being built up in ways that isolate and separate people rather than bringing people together.
Yeah,
and
it leads to loneliness instead of like community and connection.
And so I think we really need to reevaluate like even the communal aspects of what's written in scripture and how do we bring that understanding of like my life impacts yours, you know, and your life impacts mine. Like your joys are mine and your sorrows are mine, and your success allows me to actually be more successful. And how do we begin to really care about the flourishing of all people? Like this is when we pray like your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, right? Like this is the picture of shalom to me. Like this is what I'm asking is bring your wholeness, God, bring your flourishing, make all of the wrong things right, bring your restoration, rebuild, you know, in a way that reflects your original intention and desire. And, but a lot of times we take that and we think like, yeah, let's do that for the church. Let's do that for the people that believe already, you know? But what does it mean for all people to flourish? You know, and am I concerned about that? And am I trying to create spaces that allow for community for all people, regardless of their faith? And am I creating spaces and practices and policies or, you know, whatever realm I'm in that actually allow for the flourishing of all people, that they would be able to have those barriers removed that are preventing them from seeking the Lord, because that's why they were put in this specific time in this specific place. You know, if we go back to Acts 17, you know, like,
that's the stewardship of it,
you know,
right there.
So so how am I stewarding this? Am I trying to create a name for myself within Christianity? Or am I stewarding a geographical region in a way that I can ensure that I'm hosting the presence of God, then that I'm being a person of presence for the people around me so that they can find who he is, you know? Yeah.
So deep. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Renee. It's just a gift to be with you and to just walk through the depth that you bring to our conversation. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
And
Thanks
you,
for
Pete.
having me.
Yeah. Thank you, Pete, for co-hosting today. I do got to point out something that some of our listeners and watchers might have been noticing the whole time. And that is that we're slowly building up this east side chair and east side corner here.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and thank you. And so today we've replaced the fake plant that used to be over on the east side there with a lava lamp. I hope that made you feel at home today,
It did,
Pete.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing the upper left hat.
My pleasure.
We're getting better and better. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.